The sun hung low over the dusty plains of Fort Benton, Arizona, in the summer of 1876. Its golden light spilled across the weathered wooden barracks, painting long shadows on the packed earth. The air was thick with the scent of sagebrush and horse sweat, and a faint breeze stirred the silence of the early evening. Soldiers milled about the fort's central yard, their boots scuffing the dirt, their voices low and tired after a long day of drills. Fort Benton was a small outpost, a speck in the vast desert, where men waited for something or anything to break the monotony of their lives. In the heart of the fort stood a woman named Clara Monroe. She was 32, with auburn hair tied back in a loose braid and eyes the color of storm clouds. Clara wasn't tall, but she carried herself with a quiet strength that made her seem larger than she was. Her calico dress, faded from years of wear, fluttered slightly in the breeze. She stood near the well, a bucket of water at her feet, her hands resting calmly on her hips. To the soldiers, she was a familiar sight of the laundress who washed their uniforms, mended their socks, and kept to herself. But there was more to Clara than they knew. Clara had come to Fort Benton 2 years ago, following her brother, Tom, a private in the cavalry. After their parents died, Tom was all she had left. When he enlisted, she followed, not because she wanted adventure, but because she couldn't bear to be alone. The fort was a hard place for a woman. The men respected her work, but some saw her as an outsider, a fragile thing in a world of guns and grit. Clara didn't mind their whispers. She had learned to live with them, just as she had learned to live with the ache in her heart, a longing for something more than this endless cycle of washing and waiting. The problem came with Colonel Amos Hargrove. He was a man of 50, broad-shouldered and barrel-chested, with a voice that could shake the rafters. Hargrove had arrived at Fort Benton 6 months ago, and his presence had changed the fort's rhythm. He was strict, quick to anger, and carried a sense of entitlement that made the men bristle. To Hargrove, the fort was his kingdom, and everyone in it, soldiers, cooks, and Clara was his to command. He'd taken a particular interest in Clara, not out of kindness, but out of a need to assert his power. He'd linger by the well when she worked, his eyes sharp and predatory, his comments laced with a false charm that made her skin crawl. Clara bore it quietly, as she always had. She didn't want trouble. She wanted to do her work, send money to Tom when he was on patrol, and keep her head down. But Hargrove's attention grew heavier, like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. The soldiers noticed it too. They'd glance at Clara, then away, unsure what to do. Some pitied her, others thought she should just give in, make life easier for everyone. Clara heard their murmurs, felt their eyes, but she kept her focus on the washboard, her hands moving in steady, deliberate strokes. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains, the fort was quieter than usual. The men had gathered in the yard for a rare moment of rest, sitting on crates or leaning against the barracks, sharing stories and passing a flask. Clara was at the well, hauling up a bucket of water, her arms aching from a long day's work. The air was warm, heavy with the promise of a desert night. She paused, wiping sweat from her brow, and felt a shadow fall over her. "Evening, Clara," Hargrove said, his voice low and oily. He stood too close, his boots planted wide, his hands on his belt. The silver buttons of his uniform gleamed in the fading light. "Evening, Colonel," Clara replied, her tone flat. She kept her eyes on the bucket, her hands steady. "You work too hard," he said, stepping closer. "A woman like you shouldn't be out here alone. You need someone to look after you." Clara's jaw tightened. She'd heard this before, the same words dressed up in different ways. "I manage fine," she said, pulling the bucket from the well. Water sloshed over the rim, soaking the hem of her dress. Hargrove chuckled, a sound that made her stomach turn. "You're stubborn, aren't you? I like that. But you ought to learn your place." The yard went quiet. The soldiers, some 40 yards away, turned their heads, sensing the shift in the air. Clara felt their eyes on her, felt the weight of their silence. She set the bucket down, slowly, deliberately, and faced Hargrove. "My place is here, doing my work," she said, her voice calm but firm. Hargrove's smile faded, his eyes narrowed, and he took another step, closing the distance between them. "You don't talk to me like that," he said, his voice dropping to a growl. "You're nothing but a laundress. You'll do as I say." Clara's heart pounded, but she didn't move. She could smell the whiskey on his breath, see the flush in his cheeks. The soldiers were watching now, their conversations stilled, their bodies tense. Hargrove raised his hand, his fingers curled into a fist, and the world seemed to slow. Clara saw the arc of his arm, the glint of his ring, the anger in his eyes. She didn't think, she didn't hesitate. In one fluid motion, Clara stepped to the side, her hands moving faster than anyone expected. She grabbed Hargrove's wrist, twisted it hard, and used his own momentum against him. There was a sickening crack, like a dry branch snapping. Hargrove gasped, his face contorting in pain as he stumbled back, clutching his wrist. The yard was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, heavy and absolute. 400 MENA soldiers, cooks, stable hands stood frozen, their eyes wide, their breaths held. Clara stood her ground, her chest rising and falling, her hands trembling but steady. Hargrove stared at her, his mouth open, his pride shattered. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, Clara picked up her bucket and walked away, her steps measured, her head high. The soldiers parted for her, their faces a mix of awe and disbelief. She didn't look back. The twist came not in the act itself, but in what followed. Word of Clara's stand spread through the fort like wildfire. By morning, the soldiers were whispering about it over breakfast, their voices tinged with something new: our respect. They'd seen Hargrove's temper, his cruelty, and they'd seen Clara, small and unassuming, break his wrist and his authority in one swift move. It wasn't just her strength that stunned them, it was her calm, her refusal to cower, her quiet defiance in the face of a man who thought he owned her. Hargrove left the fort a week later, his wrist bandaged, his reputation in tatters. The official report said he'd been reassigned, but everyone knew the truth. Clara went back to her work, washing shirts and mending socks, as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. The soldiers no longer looked at her with pity or indifference. They nodded when she passed, tipped their hats, brought her extra firewood without being asked. They saw her now not just as the laundress, but as Clara, the woman who'd stood up to a bully and won. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, Clara sat on a bench outside the barracks, a cup of coffee in her hands. The air was cool, the stars just beginning to appear. Tom, her brother, sat beside her, his uniform dusty from a week-long patrol. He'd heard the story, of course, everyone had. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "You could have gotten hurt." Clara looked at him, her eyes soft but steady. "I had to, Tom," she said. "Not for me, for all of us." Tom nodded, his throat tight. He reached for her hand, and they sat in silence, watching the desert settle into night. The fort was quieter now, not just in sound, but in spirit. Hargrove's shadow was gone, and in its place was something new: a sense of unity, of respect, of hope. Clara didn't feel like a hero. She felt like herself, maybe for the first time in years. She'd come to Fort Benton to follow her brother, to survive, to keep going. But in that moment by the well, she'd found something more: a strength she hadn't known she had, a courage that didn't need to shout. It was enough to know that she'd stood up, not just for herself, but for every person who'd ever felt small under someone else's power. The soldiers never forgot that evening. Years later, when they told the story, they described the way the light caught Clara's hair, the way her hands moved like lightning, the way 400 men stood speechless in the dust. But Clara didn't need their stories, she had her own. And as she sat with Tom, the desert stretching out before them, she felt a quiet peace settle over her, like a blanket warmed by the sun. The fort would go on, as forts do. New soldiers would come, new commanders would take charge, but Clara's stand would linger, a small but unshakable light in the memory of Fort Benton. And for Clara, that was enough.